I arrived at Krynos 9 aboard the Omniscia's Vow, the retrieval cadre in tow, knowing from the first telemetry reports that the impossible had already begun. Every cog, every servo, every shard of metal on the planet's surface hummed in harmonic resonance. But the planet's power grids were offline. Sensors screamed contradictions. Heat and cold coexisted in the same corridor. Gravity fluctuated in subtle waves, and the very air seemed to pulse with anticipation. It was as if the Forge world itself remembered some forbidden memory, and it whispered in binary and prayer alike. Our entry point was the Iron Sanctum, a section of the Forge world long abandoned due to an uprising of the cult of the flesh cog. The doors groaned against centuries of rust and ritualized neglect. I traced the inscriptions along the frame, half-binary script, half-liturgical litanies, etched deep into the oxidized iron. Bow, or be broken. One phrase repeated in a sequence that pulsed like the heartbeat of the planet itself. I noted it in my log, anomalous, yet unmistakably intentional. The first observation post, once a simple maintenance chamber, was no longer simple. A servo arm, dormant for decades, twitched independently, its movements deliberate, then froze mid-air, leaving scorch marks on the floor. The cadre exchanged nervous glances. Their voxcasters were silent, their eyes flickering with recognition that we had entered a zone where law, physics, and logic no longer held dominion. I advanced, my augmetic eye streaming overlays. Temperature gradients, stress fractures in the metal, warp readings beyond permissible thresholds. Each step echoed unnaturally. Sounds seemed to arrive before I made them. I reported to Magos Dominus Raethor. Sanctum parameters irregular, gravity inconsistent, temperature non-homogeneous. Immediate structural recalibration advised his reply was delayed, garbled. A signal contaminated by some force that existed just outside comprehension. Hallways stretched and contracted in impossible ways. The walls, once smooth and polished, seemed to breathe. I could feel the hum beneath the metal plating, a resonance not mechanical, but biological. It was subtle at first, a pulse that ran through the soles of my feet, through the iron of my chassis, into the marrow of my bones. Then louder, stronger. The cadence of it matched nothing I had ever recorded. A heartbeat, but not a heartbeat. A liturgical chant, but without words. We moved as a unit, cautious. My log recorded every anomaly, interspersed with ritual incantations from the inscriptions along the walls. The Iron Sanctum's corridors were lined with machinery that defied reason. Conveyors moved without motors. Forges glowed with flame absent of fuel, and coolant ducts dripped blackened condensation that smelled of iron and decay. Servitors, seemingly dormant, twitched sporadically, their augmetics sparking with forbidden energy. A micro cliffhanger presented itself. Within minutes, a maintenance servo arm aligned itself with others in a pattern across the floor. From above, the arrangement formed a geometric symbol I recognized from the litany of cogitation, a ritual diagram intended to bind sentience into machine flesh. I stopped mid-step, augmetic lenses scanning, cross-referencing archival files. The symbol pulsed faintly, a low-frequency resonance vibrating through the chamber, through my frame, through the air itself. "Observe," I instructed the cadre, my voice modulated with calm I did not feel. "It is not inert. It moves with purpose." One junior tech priest knelt, running diagnostic probes along the edges of the diagram. The readings were impossible. Material density shifted while being scanned. Glyphic resonance modulated independently of any known energy source. It was as if the Forge world itself was alive and aware of our scrutiny. I recorded the first sensory anomaly, an oppressive cold, interspersed with bursts of searing heat. Thermo readings fluctuated by hundreds of degrees in mere moments. Air density remained inconsistent. Respiratory augmentation was required to stabilize oxygen intake. Every pulse of the floor beneath my boots seemed timed to the liturgical phrases etched in the walls. Repetition of sacred words, the Omnissiah's litanies, became distorted echoes, rearranging themselves mid-air, mid-thought. By the time we reached the central hall, the true gravity of the anomaly became apparent. The Forge world obeyed a new rule, one I could neither calculate nor anticipate. Floors flexed as if elastic. Walls expanded and contracted. Shadows stretched beyond the angle of light. The hum beneath my augmetics now carried tonal variation, high-pitched cries intertwined with resonant bass, producing a melody I instinctively understood as warning, a micro-cliffhanger. The servo arm we had first observed fell to the floor with a resounding clang, then rose again of its own accord, forming a rudimentary kneeling posture. Its servos emitted a harmonic tone resembling a guttural prayer. The message was clear. Intelligence was present. Not human, not entirely machine, not entirely warp, but all in one. I logged the final observation for the chapter. All systems report offline, yet all systems function. The Iron Sanctum is awake. We are observed. We are evaluated. Reality bends here. Our presence is recorded, and the Forge world answers. As the chapter closed, I sensed the whisper in the air again. Bow, or be broken. Not merely inscribed, not merely heard. Felt a literal imperative, binding, unavoidable. And then, the floor beneath the junior tech priest shifted, revealing a gap into darkness that should not exist. A low hum emanated from below, vibrating through bone and steel alike. I raised my hand to stop him, but the next step, inevitably, carried us deeper into the anomaly. The Iron Sanctum awaited, and it knew we were here. The door sealed behind us with a metallic groan that reverberated far longer than the dimensions of the chamber should have allowed. I turned, augmetic eye focusing on the adamantine slab. No locking mechanisms were visible, no hydraulics engaged, yet the door had closed as though willed shut by unseen command. The cadre stood in tense silence. Even the most junior of tech priests could feel it. The wrongness in the air. Every sound in the chamber seemed to duplicate itself. I would speak, and a half-breath later, my words would echo back, distorted, as if repeated by a voice I did not recognize. I activated Vox Link. Command node. Report status of Inner Sanctum. Confirmation required, hiss answered, long and low, accompanied by binary static that resolved into words I could not attribute to any source. Plus, the machine, God sees you, plus. No transponder signature accompanied the phrase. No Vox channel registered active. It had emerged from nowhere, yet carried the unmistakable weight of authority. The walls were lined with ancient cogitation beams, their crystalline cores darkened by centuries of disuse. And yet, as we advanced deeper, the black crystal began to glow with faint inner fire. First one, then another, then another. Like the sequential ignition of a litany chant, each crystal pulsed once, then twice, syncing with that impossible hum we had first felt at entry. I catalogued the phenomenon. Non-standard resonance. Suggests external harmonics forcing sequential ignition. Source unidentified. My voice trembled in my own ears. The cadre dispersed with trained precision, each moving to scan different terminals, though all terminals should have been long dead. Their Auspex readings were contradictory. Some reported power surges at catastrophic levels, others absolute absence of current. The only constant was the hum, the low, ceaseless vibration of a presence watching us. The chamber's air carried a metallic tang, heavier now, as though every breath I drew contained filings of iron. My internal filters cycled at maximum, still unable to purge the sensation of swallowing rust. "Magos," one of the junior priests whispered through Vox. His augmetic voice modulator flickered, the signal cutting in and out. The beams. They reflect nothing. Look, observe, I turned. His light beam, projected from a cranial implant, struck the crystal directly. The beam should have scattered. It did not. It entered the crystal as though falling into a void, and the void gave nothing back. The beam vanished. Then, a moment later, light spilled out, not from the same crystal, but from another, meters away, at a completely impossible angle. I logged it with shaking hands. Chamber architecture functions as conduit. Cause unknown. Effect intentional. Another sound began to rise, layered beneath the hum. Whispers. They were faint, fragile as spiderwebs, threaded into the resonance. Not in Gothic, not in binary. A fusion of the two, switching mid-phoneme, mid-thought. It was a language I understood and did not understand at once, its cadence both ritual and machine code. Press bow to the Omnissiah, eternal. The phrase repeated in different voices, at times mechanical, at times human, at times both. Each echo doubled the dread in my frame. I instructed the cadre to proceed with caution toward the central dais. What we found there confirmed what the first servo arm pattern had suggested: ritualized construction. The dais was engraved with geometric fractals, precise, repeating forms that shifted subtly as we watched. At first glance, triangles within circles. At second, spirals of cogs forming skeletal figures. At third, pure static. The designs altered under observation. The rule of stable geometry itself had broken. Servitors lined the walls, dozens of them. Their flesh had long withered, their augmetics rusted, their cogitator stacks dark. But as the chamber filled with whispers, their eyes lit, one by one, pale and glassy. Their mouths moved, exhaling dust and prayer in the same breath. Praise the machine god. Praise. Praise. Their voices were hollow, their litanies fragmented, but they spoke in unison. I advanced, every augmetic nerve on edge. Their faces were long dead, their bodies collapsed to brittle sinew, and yet they chanted. I scanned one with auspex. No neural activity, no blood circulation. The body was dead. The machine was dead, but they moved regardless. The realization settled cold into my core. This sanctum no longer required life to speak. It used echoes. It used memory. It used whatever fragments of voice and thought remained imprinted in matter itself. My cadre began to falter. One collapsed to his knees, clutching his cranial implant, vox speakers screeching incoherent hymns. The sanctum was not only watching us, it was inside us. The crystals on the walls pulsed harder now, their light saturating the chamber. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, bending around us, reaching toward the dais. And then the dais itself moved. Its surface split with a groan like steel tearing, revealing beneath it a hollow shaft. A wind rushed upward, though no air should have been displaced. The smell that followed was thick and wet, an impossible mix of sacred incense and rotting flesh. I peered downward. Stairs descended, winding into darkness. The walls glistened with moisture, though it was neither water nor oil. Lines of circuitry etched themselves across the stone in real time, forming and erasing patterns faster than the eye could follow. A micro cliffhanger. Vox distortion surged again. The same phrase, louder, more insistent. The Omnissiah demands entry. The dais sealed shut above us with violent finality, cutting off retreat. My cadre shifted, weapons half raised, though we all knew last fire was meaningless against such a phenomenon. We descended, one by one, into the hollow. The echoes followed us. Our footsteps doubled, trebled, until the stairwell thundered with an army's tread. The voices layered with them. Binary code twisted into hymn, hymn broken into static, static hardened into command. Each turn of the stairwell brought fresh impossibilities. Shadows that leaned upward against gravity, moisture that sizzled on contact with metal, inscriptions that wrote themselves beneath our hands. And then, as we reached the first landing, the structure breathed. The walls expanded with a sound like ribs stretching. Air hissed out, carrying whispers louder, clearer, more certain. +++, you are observed. You are recorded. You are judged. +++, I froze. Every augmetic system in my body glitched simultaneously. Optics refracted. Auditory implants screamed feedback. Data slate logs rewrote themselves. My own voice repeated lines I had never spoken, inserted into my recordings as if memory itself had been corrupted. The stairwell went silent. Utterly silent, except for one final echo, vibrating through marrow and machine alike. +++, bow, or be broken, +++. The phrase no longer inscribed, no longer ambient. It came from within my own mind, my own augmetics, my own soul. And at the landing's edge, a door awaited us. It was open. Its frame glowed faint red, like the inside of a furnace. Beyond it stretched a corridor not built by Mechanicus' hand, not inscribed by Imperial sanction. The geometry was wrong. Angles bent inward. Surfaces rippled as though liquid. It was an invitation and a command. I raised my hand to halt the cadre. We stared into the impossible corridor. The hum returned, louder, stronger, and in that moment, I knew we were no longer within a Forge World sector at all. We had stepped into something else, something alive, something eternal. The corridor should not have existed, its angles bent inward like the ribs of some great beast, its surfaces rippling as though half substance, half liquid. I paused at its threshold, logging every detail, though my auspex returned only noise. The readings declared absence, yet my senses reported overwhelming presence. The hum intensified as we crossed the threshold. Each step landed upon flooring that flexed subtly, as though I walked across flesh sheathed in iron. The temperature readings faltered, leaping from freezing void to furnace heat with every few paces. Moisture condensed on my augmetics, then immediately froze, leaving a brittle shell of frost upon steel. The cadre followed with forced discipline, though the whispers unsettled them. The voices here were louder, crawling over the inside of the skull rather than entering through ears. Binary interlaced with hymnals, syllables snapping midstream into numbers, numbers reforming as prayers. My mind translated them involuntarily. +++BOWBINDMERG+++. I halted at a junction. The walls ahead pulsed faintly, veins of red light beating in rhythm to a heart not ours. The floor beneath shifted. I activated my internal stabilizers, compensating for the sudden lurch of gravity as it fell, away for half a second, then returned, denser than before. The effect disoriented two junior priests. They stumbled, their metallic limbs striking the floor with discordant clangs. And then the first horror revealed itself. A servitor, long dormant in its wall alcove, convulsed with violent spasms. At first I thought it a malfunction, augmetic limbs shuddering, head twitching. But then, from its flesh, something grew. Thin filaments, metal yet sinew, sprouted like roots, grafting themselves into the corridor walls. Its chest split, not with gore, but with cables unfurling like intestines of brass and copper. I scanned its life signs. No biological activity. No cogitator signals. It is dead, and yet it moved. The filaments writhed, lashing at the air, slamming into the metal floor with enough force to leave scars. Its mouth opened and closed, expelling static that coalesced into words, broken and fragmented. Praise, praise the eternal cog, bow, bow, bow. Its jaw tore free with the force, dangling by strands of sinew and wire, yet it continued to chant, now louder, now deeper, vibrating through the chamber like a vox horn. One of my cadre faltered. Enginsir Haleth raised his last cutter, voice shaking. Magos, we must— I silenced him with a hand. To fire was to acknowledge fear. To acknowledge fear was to yield ground. Still, my own hands trembled. The servitor's eyes, once glassy orbs of pale augmentation, lit with fire. Not plasma, Not energy I could quantify, fire that cast no light, fire that burned the mind, and then it stopped. Limbs slackened, cables released. Its body collapsed into a twisted heap of bone and metal. The filaments retracted into the corridor walls, leaving no trace they had ever emerged. Only the scorch marks remained. I recorded it clinically. First manifestation of corridor anomaly. Fusion of mechanical and biological material. Rules of life and death disregarded. Observation: anomaly is self-directing. The cadre's unease grew. Vox channels flickered with incoherent bursts of chanting. My own auspex picked up phantom signals, registering cadre members in positions they did not occupy. Duplicate shadows flickered in corners, moving a second out of sync. I began to realize the sanctum was not merely corrupting the environment. It was rewriting the act of observation itself. What I saw, what I logged, what I believed, all subject to alteration. At the next junction, the walls displayed etchings that had not been there before. They resembled the ritual pattern we had seen formed by servo arms in the entry chamber, but warped, fractals spiraling into distorted mockeries of the sacred cog. Numbers spiraled across the floor, repeating sequences of 3, 6, and 9. My augmetic eye tried to stabilize the symbols, but every frame of data returned a different shape. "Magos," Haleth whispered again, clutching at his head. "The numbers, they are inside my skull." I approached him. His cranial implant flickered, projecting streams of code into the air unbidden. His systems had been breached. The code spiraled into geometry, glowing faint red as it burned itself into the air like afterimages on the retina. Then his body seized. He convulsed violently, collapsing to the floor. From his mouth poured not bile nor blood, but a cascade of metallic dust. The dust swirled upward, forming sigils in midair, before disintegrating into nothing. Haleth lay still, dead. And yet his Vox link clicked once. "We bow." The voice was his and not his, mechanical, ritual, eternal. I froze. My augmetic screamed alarm. Telemetry breach. Source internal. The sanctum had claimed him, not as flesh, not as machine, as both and neither. The remaining cadre backed away, fear leaking into their mechanical voices despite the modulation. One dropped his staff, the clang echoing impossibly long. Shadows lengthened from the staff's impact, stretching across the floor to touch the walls. And when they touched, the walls pulsed, alive, responding as if fed. I steadied my mind, logged it in cold clarity. First cadre loss. Transformation without organic process. Anomaly capable of rewriting the states of matter and identity. Conclusion: self-awareness probable. We pressed onward. What else was there to do? Retreat was impossible. The dais had sealed above. To remain still was to be consumed. The corridor narrowed, pressing us into single file. The hum rose to a shriek inside the skull. Every nerve burned, every circuit stuttered. The next chamber opened suddenly, vast and domed, its ceiling lost in shadow. Here the hum became a full chant. Hundreds of voices layered, weaving into one another, human and mechanical alike. The words became clear: plus 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 BOW, BIND, MERGE, plus plus plus. And beneath the chant, I heard something else, something impossibly deep. A resonance that was not sound at all, but pressure, pushing against the mind. I staggered, hand braced against the wall. My augmetic palm burned, because the wall was warm, not with heat, with pulse, a steady beat, a heartbeat. The iron sanctum was not architecture, it was not dead metal, it was alive. The realization locked my limbs. My cadre watched me in silence. No one dared speak. Then, a sudden silence fell. The chant stopped. The hum ceased. From the darkness of the domed ceiling, something shifted. I did not see it fully, only the impression of immense bulk, gears the size of buildings, veins of fire threading through flesh and iron. And then, an eye. One singular, vast, burning eye opened in the shadow above. Not flesh, not lens, both, neither. It looked directly into me, into every data slate, every nerve, every prayer I had ever uttered. My augmetic screamed as if torn apart. Logs overwrote themselves, my mind filled with alien words. Plus, 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 the first of you is taken. Others will follow, bow, or be broken. Plus, plus, plus. I collapsed to one knee, more in reflex than in worship. The chamber pulsed with approval. Haleth's body, once lifeless, rose again. Jerking, twisting, wires sprouting from his spine like wings of iron. His voice, layered with machine code, echoed in perfect harmony with the chamber. The Wither's children had been buried once more. Their coffins, now marked by stones, rested beneath a new patch of consecrated ground in the hills beyond the settlement. The villagers had labored in silence that day. No prayers offered, no hymns sung. The priest's voice had faltered before he could finish the rites, and the silence had spread like a sickness across the mourners. Yet even with the bodies deep in the soil, unease lingered. The first signs came at night. Families whose cabins stood closest to the new burial site reported hearing faint knocks, soft as fingernails upon wood. A shepherd claimed he heard children's laughter carried on the wind, though no child dared leave their home after dusk. Dogs refused to go near the graves, hackles raised and eyes fixed on something invisible. The soil itself seemed unsettled. Each dawn, when men and women returned to check the graves, they found the earth slightly shifted. Not dug open, no, but as though it had risen, breathed, and settled again. One widow whispered that she had seen small handprints pressed into the dirt. No one believed her aloud, but no one laughed either. Inside the town, rumors began to coil tighter with every retelling. Some swore the children had not truly died, that they were caught in some liminal state between life and death. Others claimed a curse had been called upon the Withers family generations ago, a debt now being collected in blood and sorrow. One evening, Elias, the town's blacksmith, returned from checking the burial ground. His face was pale, his hands trembling despite the calluses burned into his skin. He told of hearing a soft voice beneath the soil, calling his name, asking to be let out. Elias had been a man of iron certainty, a man who bent steel with his will, but that night he drank himself senseless, shaking as though winter's chill had frozen into his bones. The priest, pressed for guidance, confessed a truth he had hoped never to speak. This was not the first disturbance tied to the Withers bloodline. He recalled his mentor once mentioning strange rites, whispered connections to old faiths, carried across oceans before the frontier towns ever rose. The Withers clan had long been marked as restless, a word too gentle to capture the shadow that seemed to stalk their name. By the fourth night after burial, the disturbances grew bold. Windows rattled though no storm passed. Sleep was broken by scratching sounds beneath the floorboards, as if something sought entry from below. And in the silence that followed, some families reported hearing a lullaby, a mother's song. Soft, sweet, and entirely wrong. The town's fear no longer spoke in whispers. They gathered at the chapel, demanding action. Some called for burning the graves, reducing the remains to ash so that no part of the Withers children could return. Others warned that such desecration might only deepen the curse, binding it tighter. Every argument was desperate, every word trembling on the edge of panic. The priest urged patience, insisting that faith would hold against whatever haunted them. But his eyes betrayed his fear, and his hands shook as he held the scripture. Outside, the night deepened. In the hills, the soil shifted once more, a faint rise and fall as though the earth itself drew breath. And somewhere beneath, something stirred. The decision was made in quiet terror. Though the priest spoke of patience and faith, the town could not endure another night of restless whispers. They agreed to wait until the 13th night after the Withers children's latest burial, a number chosen not from scripture, but from fear. The 13th night, they said, would reveal the truth. If the graves still shifted, if the voices still carried on the wind, then they would act. The days crawled by. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men patrolled with lanterns and rifles, though their courage wore thinner with each creak of the earth. At dawn, people gathered around the burial site in hushed clusters, staring at the disturbed soil, watching it as if it might suddenly move before their eyes. By the 9th night, the voices grew clearer. A farmer claimed to hear not just laughter, but pleading. He said he heard the youngest Withers girl crying for her mother. His wife forbade him from returning to the graves, yet the sound haunted him still, echoing even in his sleep. On the 11th night, a storm swept across the hills, though the sky had been clear only an hour before. Rain lashed down upon the burial ground, and lightning split the sky directly above the children's graves. In the morning, when the villagers dared approach, the markers had shifted, not toppled, but moved, as though someone beneath had pressed them from below. By the 12th night, none in the town could sleep. The lullaby had returned. Now, more than one family heard it, and each described the same melody, low, slow, and sung in a voice no mother would claim. Windows were shuttered tight, doors barred, prayers whispered until throats went dry. But the songs seeped through wood and stone, filling dreams with dread. Then came the 13th night. The town gathered in full at the chapel. Lanterns burned, their light shivering across strained faces. The priest led them in prayer, his voice breaking as he begged for deliverance. And then the bells struck midnight. The sound began as a rumble, soft, distant, like the rolling of far-off thunder. The earth trembled beneath their feet. Some fell to their knees, clutching the pews. The sound deepened, spreading outward from the hills. A boy cried out, pointing toward the windows. The townsfolk turned to see a glow on the horizon, faint and pulsing, as though the soil itself were alight. The glow throbbed in rhythm, like a heartbeat. Despite their terror, a group of men armed themselves and went to the burial ground. Lanterns swayed in their shaking hands as they trudged through the wet grass, the storm clouds above giving no moonlight. When they reached the graves, they stopped cold. The soil was moving, not shifting lightly as before, but rising, swelling upward, as though the earth strained to birth something unholy. The men swore they saw hands, small, pale hands, pressing against the soil from beneath, clawing to break free. One man screamed and dropped his lantern, its flame catching the grass. Another raised his rifle and fired into the ground. But the bullet only sent dirt flying. The voices rose then, many voices, children's voices, crying, laughing, begging all at once. Back at the chapel, those who had remained felt the floorboards tremble. Dust shook loose from the rafters, and faintly, carried on the wind, they too heard the chorus of voices. The men at the graves could not endure it. They fled, stumbling back toward the town, their lanterns swinging wildly. Only one did not return. Elias, the blacksmith. He had lingered, staring at the graves, frozen as if spellbound. His cries echoed after the others, sharp and desperate, then fell silent. When the townsfolk rushed to bar their doors, Elias did not come. His hammer hung in his empty forge, still warm from the fire. The 13th night had spoken, and it was only the beginning. Morning brought no peace. The town awoke hollow-eyed, their bodies present, but their spirits broken. Every voice in the chapel last night had sworn to hearing the children calling, and no one could deny that Elias the blacksmith had not returned. His forge stood open, the embers of the fire cold and gray. His apron lay draped across a stool, and the hammer he had wielded since boyhood rested by the anvil. It was as though he had only stepped away for a moment, but Elias was gone. A search was organized, though none were eager to return to the burial ground. The priest insisted they go in daylight, believing the sun would shield them from whatever horror lurked in the earth. Yet even under the noon sun, the hill seemed wrong. Too quiet, the air thick as if holding its breath. They found no trace of Elias near the graves. The soil, disturbed and heaving the night before, now looked still, though uneven mounds suggested the earth had not settled naturally. One grave in particular, the one belonging to the youngest Wither's child, bore the marks of fresh tearing. The soil was not packed but clawed open, as though something had dragged itself out. The men argued whether to dig, but none had the strength to strike the ground. Fear had stripped them of their resolve. Instead, they searched the woods bordering the cemetery. There, beneath the pines, they found footprints. Bare, small footprints, pressed deep into the mud, heading away from the graves. Among them, larger prints appeared, heavier, wider. They followed these tracks until they broke apart near the stream. There, caught on a branch, hung a scrap of fabric. It was from Elias's shirt. The discovery spread like fire through the town. Some claimed the blacksmith had been dragged down into the earth. Others whispered he had been lured away by the voices, compelled to follow. A few, shaking and pale, said worse, that Elias had walked willingly with them. By evening, the town was divided. Some demanded the graves be dug open and salted, the bodies burned until no trace remained. Others, clinging to faith, begged for patience, insisting that desecrating the children's resting place would only curse them further. The priest, exhausted and trembling, declared they must wait until Sunday, when holy rites could be performed. But Sunday felt impossibly far away. That night, the forge did not stay empty. A glow appeared within, faint but steady. Those nearest claimed they saw Elias at his anvil, his broad frame bent over the fire. Yet when they approached, the forge was cold, the tools untouched. Only the hammer had moved, now resting upright, as though placed there by unseen hands. At the same hour, several families swore they heard knocking on their doors, not the harsh pounding of an intruder, but soft, hesitant knocks, the kind a child might give when seeking to be let inside. None dared open. The knocking faded into silence, but by morning, strange marks were found on the doors, small, muddy handprints, pressed low at a child's height. The terror became unbearable. The people gathered again, demanding the priest break his vow of waiting. But before he could answer, the chapel bells rang. They rang without human hands pulling the rope, the sound shrill and urgent, echoing through the valley. And with each toll of the bell, the graves on the hill seemed to sink deeper, as though something beneath pulled them down. The Wither's children were not content to rest, and now Elias was part of their number. Whether dead or something worse, none could yet say. The bells had always been a comfort to the town. Their slow tolls marked the passing of hours, the call to prayer, the rhythm of life in a place so isolated that even the mountains seemed to stand as walls between them and the world beyond. But now, the bells rang with no human hand to pull the rope, and instead of comfort, they brought only dread. It began in the dead of night, when the stars were hidden behind clouds and the moon gave no light. The bells pealed wildly, not in measured rhythm but in frantic bursts, as though some unseen hand yanked the rope with desperation. Families woke in panic, children crying, mothers clutching their infants, fathers peering through windows at the chapel on the hill. The sound was unbearable, a metallic scream that seemed to split the very air. And yet, through the clamor, something else could be heard. Owasoi, faint, echoing laugh, childlike, weaving through the chimes. By the time the townsfolk reached the chapel, the great doors were open. No one had opened them. Inside, the nave was filled with the sound of the bells, though the tower rope lay still. The priest, pale as bone, stood at the altar, his hands shaking so violently he could not raise his cross. He whispered prayers, but his words faltered under the weight of the noise. The men rushed up the tower stairs, each step groaning under their boots. When they reached the belfry, they froze. The bell swung on its own, the iron clapper striking without pause. Worse still, each time it struck, the air shimmered, like heat rising from stone, and faint shapes appeared in the mist. Children, not solid, not flesh, but pale shadows in the outline of the Wither's children. Their mouths did not move, yet the laughter rang from their forms. They clung to the beams of the tower, crouched upon the wooden braces like spiders, their eyes dark holes that swallowed the light. One of the men cried out and stumbled back down the stairs, shoving past the others. Another raised his lantern and hurled it toward the shadows. For a moment, the tower blazed with firelight. But when the flame touched the children's forms, they did not burn. They only multiplied. Where there had been 3, now there were 6. Where 6, now 10. The laughter grew. The bell rope, coiled and still upon the floor, twitched. Slowly, it began to uncoil, slithering like a serpent toward the men. One screamed, another tried to hack it with his knife, but the rope wrapped around his wrist and pulled. He was dragged upward, his body smashing against the beams, his scream cut short by the strike of the bell. The others fled. They crashed back down the stairs, the sound of the rope whipping behind them. When they burst into the chapel, the priest was gone. The altar was overturned, the cross snapped clean in 2. Only the echo of the bells remained, louder than ever, shaking the very walls. The people fled into the night, scattering to their homes, barring doors and windows. But the bells followed. No matter where they hid, the sound burrowed into their ears, into their bones. Mothers stuffed rags into their children's ears, but the little ones still cried, clutching their heads as if the noise came from inside them. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the bells stopped. Silence fell upon the town, too deep, too heavy. Even the insects had ceased their song. It was then that the knocking began again, soft, deliberate knocks on doors and windows, always at child's height, always in 3s. The blacksmith's wife, her face hollow from grief, thought she heard Elias's voice among them. She opened her door. By morning, her house was empty. The hearth still burned, food still sat on the table, but no one remained inside. Only the marks upon the floor, the prints of bare feet, small and wet, leading out into the street, spoke of what had come. The priest was found at dawn, lying at the foot of the hill. His eyes had been torn out, and his mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. In his hand, he still clutched the broken half of the cross. Carved into his chest, deep and deliberate, were 3 words: "We are here." The townsfolk gathered in horror, but no one dared touch the body. They whispered of curses, of damnation, of sins unspoken. Some swore this was the work of witches. Others insisted it was the children, restless and vengeful. A few, their voices trembling, wondered aloud if Elias had joined them, hammer in hand, forging something in the dark for his new masters. No one spoke of the bells, not out loud, but all knew they would ring again. And when they did, the Wither's children would not come alone. The town had become a husk of itself. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted, and a pall of fear clung to every street. The morning after the priest's body was discovered, a cold wind swept through the valley, carrying with it a faint, metallic scent, sharp and bitter. It smelled of iron and decay, and beneath it, faintly, the sound of a lullaby. It began subtly, drifting through the shuttered windows of the houses. Mothers, clutching their children, recognized the melody. It was the same lullaby the Wither's children had sung before their deaths, though warped now, broken and mechanical, notes bending like molten metal. The song was impossibly layered. One voice human, one synthetic, another somewhere in between. No one knew where it came from, yet everyone heard it. Even those who tried to ignore it could not. The lullaby penetrated walls, settled into the ears like grains of sand, scratching at the mind. The children's eyes, wide and unblinking, followed shadows moving just beyond vision. They whispered names, calling to unseen figures that crouched in corners, pressed against walls, or lingered in the hallways. The blacksmith's hammer, which had vanished with him, appeared in the center of the square that morning. It was upright in the cobblestones, embedded as though the earth itself had forged it there. Around it, small handprints, muddy and wet, circled clockwise, pressing deep into the stones. No one dared touch it. The hammer emitted a faint vibration, almost imperceptible like a heartbeat, but a heartbeat that spoke of power and judgment. The townsfolk gathered in fear and desperation, whispering among themselves, attempting to rationalize what had happened. They spoke of spirits, of possession, of punishment for sins long forgotten. Yet rationalization did little to ease the growing dread. The lullaby had a presence. It was watching. It was learning. By midday, the disturbance spread further. Livestock were found dead, their bodies twisted unnaturally. Some had mouths sewn shut with strands of wire. Others had eyes replaced by small black spheres, reflecting the world with uncanny clarity. The animals that remained alive refused food, trembling in corners, their gaze fixed on invisible threats. The town dogs whimpered and scratched at doors, their instinct telling them that the nightmare had crossed from the earth into their homes. The priest had warned them of patience, yet now patience seemed cruel. The lullaby grew louder at night, carrying the sound of rusted chains, gears grinding, and metal limbs moving in tandem with the song. Those who attempted sleep found themselves awake at intervals, hearts hammering, ears ringing with the eerie cadence. Each verse of the lullaby repeated itself, subtly altered, embedding commands beneath the notes. Children began disappearing, always at night, always quietly. One moment they were in their beds, the next, only the echoes of their cries remained. The parents swore the missing children had not walked, had not fled. They were taken, drawn into shadows that none could chase. Those who tried to follow found the ground impossible to traverse. Mud that swallowed boots, roots that shifted to block paths, and air that thickened like iron-laden fog. By the fifth night, the town had emptied of courage. Every remaining adult barricaded themselves in their homes, clutching the symbols of faith and tokens of protection. Rosaries, charms, anything that might stave off the inevitable. Even so, the lullaby seeped through cracks, walls, and doors, carrying with it the undeniable sense of approaching inevitability. Then, the bells rang again. Not from the chapel tower, but from the earth itself. Deep, resonant, vibrating through stone and soil, shaking foundations, rattling the fear already etched into every frame. The lullaby aligned with the tolling. Each note, each vibration, each whisper synchronized perfectly, an orchestrated performance of terror. The square around the blacksmith's hammer became the focal point. Figures began to emerge from the fog rolling down the hills. Pale, small, skeletal silhouettes, no larger than children, but moving with uncanny precision. Their faces were featureless, yet their eyes burned with recognition, seeking out those who remained. They gathered around the hammer, forming a circle, hands raised as though in ritual. From the deepest shadows, a single figure approached. It was Elias, or what had become of him. His body was no longer human. Limbs were twisted, augmented with wire and metal grafts, pulsing with the same heartbeat that seemed to emanate from the hammer itself. His eyes glowed faint red, yet inside them lingered a trace of recognition, a fragment of the man who had once forged iron and steel. He raised a hand, and the children, those pale skeletal shadows, raised theirs as well. The lullaby intensified, filling the air, vibrating through wood, stone, and bone. Those who listened closely could hear a mechanical undertone beneath the melody, the faint clanking of gears, the hiss of steam, the metallic rasp of wire bending. The priest's voice rang out from a window. He had returned, though gaunt and trembling, his eyes wide and wild. "The Wither's blood will not rest. Seal the hammer, seal the hill, burn the earth. Do you not see what it has become?" No one moved. None could. The fear was paralyzing, but the lullaby demanded compliance, demanded submission. Those who resisted were met with the subtle push of unseen hands, the whisper of voices in their skulls, repeating commands until thought itself became impossible. Elias stepped forward, hammer in hand, and struck it against the cobblestones. The sound reverberated far beyond the town, a shock wave that twisted air and ground alike. The skeletal figures shrieked, the lullaby breaking into discordant notes, echoing across the hills. Light flickered, forming fractals of movement in the mist, patterns that could not exist in the natural world. The townsfolk fell to their knees. Some cried, some prayed, some silently surrendered, understanding that the events they witnessed were beyond human comprehension. And the lullaby, now warped, metallic, alive, continued. Bow, bind, merge, join us, or be broken. The night did not end. Hours passed, though the clocks had stopped, time itself seeming to twist under the weight of the ritual. The bells, the hammer, the shadows, and Elias moved in synchronization, forming a tableau of terror that would not fade. And then, at the faintest hint of dawn, everything stopped. The fog lifted, the children vanished, and Elias was gone. The hammer remained, upright and still, vibrating faintly, as though the heartbeat had not ceased, only paused. The town lay silent, broken, hollowed out by the night's horrors. No one dared speak. No one dared move. Only the faint echo of the lullaby remained, drifting through the hills, promising return, whispering of eternity, a song that would not be forgotten. The Wither's children were no longer buried, no longer bound. They had risen, and the town, once alive, vibrant, and secure, had become a place of waiting for the next toll of the bells, the next note of the lullaby, the next step of Elias's hammer. The nightmare had begun its endless repetition, and all who survived understood. The lullaby would never cease. The town had grown silent, not merely in speech, but in spirit. Windows shuttered, doors barricaded, streets abandoned. Yet the air thrummed with the lingering presence of the Wither's children and the hammer. Even in their absence, their influence stretched across every shadow, bending the natural order. It began with small, almost imperceptible movements. Doors ajar that had been locked tight, windows that rattled though no wind blew, steps echoing where no one walked. The townsfolk whispered of ghostly hands, brushing against their clothes, tugging at hair, always felt but never seen. Fear had become tactile. By nightfall, the air carried the metallic scent of iron, thick and bitter, crawling under fingernails, into lungs, coating the tongue. Those who attempted sleep were kept awake by the faint heartbeat resonating from the hammer, now pulsating in rhythm with a song none could understand, yet felt compelled to obey. A group of men ventured toward the square where the hammer stood, drawn by curiosity, defiance, or desperation. As they approached, shadows stretched unnaturally from their forms, elongated and distorted. Shapes flickered across walls, not matching the men's movements. They froze as the air shifted. The sound of machinery whispered beneath the wind, gears grinding, pistons hissing, servitors moving in places unseen. When they reached the hammer, they found something new. Rust had begun to bloom across its surface. Not the ordinary oxidation of weather, but rust that pulsed like flesh, veins of brown crawling across iron, small rivulets like blood trickling along its shaft. The hammer vibrated more strongly now, and beneath the vibrations, the faintest voices called, chanting, "Boo! Bind! Merge!" The men recoiled, yet their feet would not move. A compulsion gripped them, an invisible tether connecting their very wills to the hammer. One of them, trembling, reached out. His hand hovered above it, the air between them shimmering, heat and cold battling in waves. As soon as his fingers brushed the metal, images flooded his mind. Visions of iron limbs grafted to children, faces twisted in eternal servitude, the blacksmith's hammer raised high above a circle of pale skeletal figures. He screamed. The others turned to see shadows detach from the walls, coalescing into forms vaguely human, yet made entirely of metal and sinew. Limbs stretched and twisted, faces elongated and featureless. They moved with jerky precision, stepping into the light yet casting no shadows. The hammer thrummed again, a resonant pulse through earth and stone. A shock wave rippled outward, throwing the men backward. One fell into a ditch, caught in a tangle of roots that seemed to rise from the earth itself, binding him in place. Another clawed at his eyes, shouting incomprehensible words, driven mad by glimpses of the impossible. From the hill, a faint, glowing outline appeared. Elias, or what had once been Elias, descended. His body was fused with wires, cables, and iron plates, his face a mask of flesh and machine. Each step left molten iron in his wake, steam rising where his feet met the cobblestones. He raised the hammer, which had grown larger, heavier, its head now etched with sigils of unknown origin. The skeletal figures turned toward him in perfect synchrony, kneeling before the artifact. The lullaby resumed, layered with the rhythm of gears and the rasp of metal scraping against metal. A scream erupted from one of the men, and the shadow forms closed in. They did not touch him, at least, not physically. Their influence pressed upon his mind, bending his perception. He saw himself split into many forms, his body stretched and twisted, gears grafted to sinew, eyes replaced with sensors. He clawed at the hallucination, but the image persisted. The remaining townsfolk, watching from a distance, could only pray. The priest's voice rang out, carried by desperation. "Mark this ground, consecrate it, call upon the saints. Do not yield, for if the hammer rises, all is lost." But the words fell flat. The sanctity of faith no longer held sway here. The hammer's pulse resonated with the soil, the stones, the air itself. Elias raised it high, and the skeletal children shifted into motion. They began a slow, deliberate march toward the town. Those too close tried to flee, but the streets seemed to bend and elongate. Cobblestones rearranged themselves underfoot, alleys twisted impossibly, leading them back toward the square. Panic became instinct. Instinct became paralysis. One by one, they were caught, pulled into shadows, swallowed into the air itself. From inside the church, the priest watched, powerless. His rosary dangled from his wrist, beads snapping as he shook. In a final act, he hurled the remains of the altar across the nave. The wood exploded into splinters, scattering across the floor. For a moment, the pulse of the hammer faltered. The skeletal children paused. But it was only temporary. Elias struck the hammer into the cobblestones again. A pulse of heat and light radiated outward, and when it subsided, the skeletal children were gone. In their place, the missing townsfolk now crouched, eyes vacant, wires sprouting from their skin, small gears embedded beneath their flesh. They moved in a hypnotic procession toward the hill, toward the burial site, toward the rising hum of power. The priest fell to his knees, repeating prayers, tears streaming down his face. One of the altered townsfolk, a young boy, paused and turned toward him. The boy's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Instead, a thin stream of metallic dust spilled forth, coating the priest's robes. The dust settled into intricate patterns, the sigils carved into the hammer. The priest screamed. He did not survive. The last vestiges of human defiance in the square had been extinguished. Elias, hammer in hand, ascended the hill. The skeletal children, now merged with the earth, rose behind him, forming a slow, mechanical procession. The hill itself seemed to breathe, its soil pulsing with life that was neither plant, animal, nor machine, yet contained aspects of all. From the distance, the few remaining structures of the town quivered. Windows shattered. Doors were wrenched from hinges. The air itself warped, bending light, sound, and perception. And then, silence. A silence so complete, it pressed against the ears and lungs. The lullaby had stopped. The hammer rested upon the hill, its pulse now imperceptible, yet omnipresent. The Wither's children and their mechanical legion vanished from sight, leaving only impressions in the soil, marks in the stones, and a lingering sense of eternity. The town was empty. Not a soul remained to witness the aftermath, save for the faintest trace of consciousness clinging to the priest's shattered rosary. And in the distance, faint, like a promise, the bells began to toll once more. Dawn never arrived. The horizon, which should have been painted with gold and pink, remained an oppressive gray, heavy with clouds that seemed to pulse in time with the hammer's heartbeat. The town, if it could still be called that, lay in ruin. Empty streets lined with broken doors and shattered windows. Smoke rose from hearths long abandoned, and the scent of iron lingered in the air, thick and unyielding. No birds sang, no animals moved. The wind carried only the faint metallic whisper of gears grinding, faint echoes of the lullaby that had once driven the town into madness. The air itself seemed alive, pressing against those who dared approach, bending perception. Even from a distance, it was impossible to look upon the ruins for long without feeling a tug, as though the town demanded entry. The hill where the hammer rested had grown in prominence. What had once been a modest rise now loomed, black soil churning as though the earth had become a furnace. Metallic shapes could be glimpsed beneath the surface, small hands pressing against dirt, wire-thin fingers grasping upward. Elias, or what remained of him, had become a singular note of command, controlling a legion of the hallowed. Those townsfolk and skeletal children now merged with iron and flesh. No one dared venture near. Scouts from neighboring settlements had reported strange occurrences, paths folding back upon themselves, shadows moving independently, and the sound of children laughing where no children existed. The Imperial authorities, once contacted, had declared the site a quarantine zone, but even their greatest sanctioned psychers refused entry. The town had become a locus of warp-tainted reality. Inside the ruins, the hammer sat upright, pulsing faintly. The soil shifted around it, writhing as though the ground itself were alive, feeding from the chaos above. The hallowed moved through the streets in silent procession, tracing the routes they had once taken as humans, yet leaving behind unnatural impressions. Grooves in the cobblestones, metal fragments embedded in walls, and marks that resembled intricate circuitry pressed into the soil. The priest's scattered remains were found near the square, his broken rosary twisted into new, unholy symbols. One of the hallowed had paused before them, bending and reshaping flesh and metal with movements impossibly precise, forming runes that glimmered faintly with warp energy. The symbols were not merely decorative. They radiated a power that altered the natural laws, bending space, slowing perception, and heightening fear. A small group of survivors had taken refuge in the forest surrounding the town. They whispered tales of watching lights move beneath broken windows, of hearing footsteps and mechanical whirring behind every tree, and of seeing figures resembling the blacksmith and children, merged with metal, pacing silently through the ruins. Those who ventured too close returned changed, murmuring in languages no one recognized, their eyes wide with knowledge that burned. One night, a scout crept back into the town. His mission was simple: gather intelligence, mark hazards, and retreat. He moved carefully, avoiding the hallowed, whose perception seemed attuned to intent rather than presence. Yet as he approached the square, he felt it, an invisible weight, a tether connecting his mind to the hammer. Every step toward it amplified the compulsion, bending his thoughts, reshaping his sense of morality. He saw Elias first. The blacksmith's form was horrifying, fused with wires, rusted gears, and sinew. His face was a pale mask, eyes glowing red, mouth opening in a silent scream that conveyed sound directly into the scout's mind. Around him, the skeletal children and hollowed shifted and swayed, moving in time with the pulse of the hammer. The scout felt the lullaby again. It was no longer a song. It was a command, vibrating through nerves and sinew, seeping into consciousness. The words were simple, insistent. Bow, bind, merge, serve. He stumbled, falling to his knees, trying to resist. The air shimmered as he struggled, warping around him. The hammer's pulse intensified. Time itself seemed to stretch and fracture. Shadows moved independently, crawling along walls, climbing trees, slithering into the forest. The scout felt the compulsion, felt the merging, felt his body yearning to rise and join the procession. And then, the impossible happened. The hammer struck the ground, not once, but 3 times. Each impact reverberated beyond physical law, shaking the soil, cracking stone, and sending vibrations through the air that altered reality itself. The scout felt the world warp. He was both standing and falling, moving forward and backward, alive and not. The hollowed around him bent reality, not intentionally, but as an extension of the hammer's pulse. When the final impact subsided, he saw them, shapes in the distance, emerging from the ruins. Not the skeletal children, not Elias, not even human forms. They were combinations of all 3, limbs grafted, heads split and merged, faces twisted in mechanical rapture. They moved with purpose, heading beyond the hill, beyond the town, reaching into the surrounding forest, seeking, claiming, merging. The scout tried to run but found the forest paths unfamiliar. Trees warped, and the ground seemed to fold, bending reality to prevent escape. A voice, faint and metallic, echoed in his mind. "You cannot leave. You belong to the machine god eternal." The scout fell to the earth, clutching his head, screaming silently as the shapes closed in. They did not speak, yet communication passed directly into neural pathways, bending perception, commanding obedience. The lullaby had become a language of control, a ritual, of submission, a mechanical liturgy that transcended human understanding. By the time the neighboring settlements realized the gravity of the situation, the hollowed had spread beyond the town. Paths were twisted, trees uprooted, and the soil itself had been altered, leaving behind a scar upon the land. The hammer's pulse extended outward, touching everything in its radius. Animals fled in terror, humans reported visions in dreams, and minor warp disturbances manifested in nearby rivers and hills. The scout's body was later found at the edge of the forest. Eyes wide open, mouth frozen mid-scream, wires and metal fragments protruding from his flesh. Inscribed upon his chest were symbols matching the hammer, faintly glowing as if feeding the artifact from a distance. No one could touch the hammer. Every attempt to move, destroy, or even approach it failed. Those who drew near were either absorbed, transformed, or left broken, mind and body warped beyond recognition. The town was no longer a place of life. It was a nexus, a factory of transformation, a monument to a power beyond understanding. The machine god eternal. The lullaby had become eternal. The hammer waited. Elias waited. The hollowed waited. And the surrounding lands, though untouched by human settlement, now trembled with awareness, sensing the pulse. The world beyond the town had not yet been touched, but it was only a matter of time. No priest, soldier, or scholar could contain this. The laws of flesh, the laws of iron, the laws of reality itself bent to the machine god. The town had fallen. Humanity was now a resource, obedience the only possible outcome, and the Wither's children, the catalysts of this transformation, were no longer bound by death. The lullaby would continue. The forest beyond the town shuddered under an unnatural gravity. Trees bent at impossible angles, their roots twisting into shapes that resembled skeletal fingers, reaching for the soil, for the air, for anything that might trespass. The Hallowed moved through this twisted landscape in a slow, deliberate procession. Their forms were now fully integrated with the machine god's will. Flesh grafted with iron, sinew intertwined with wires, and eyes that glowed faint red, as though powered by some unseen generator. Elias led them, hammer in hand, a monolithic figure of both man and machine. His movements were measured, precise, yet horrifyingly fluid, each strike of the hammer resonating with a deep pulse that synchronized the Hallowed behind him. The sound traveled through the earth, the air, and the minds of any living thing within reach. In the forest, a small band of survivors, those who had fled the town during the initial spread of the Hallowed, hid beneath the thick canopy. Their breath came in ragged gasps. They watched as the procession moved like a tide of iron and flesh, the trees themselves bending to make way. One of them, a young woman named Maris, tried to steady her trembling hands as she clutched a relic she had carried from the ruined chapel, a fragment of the priest's cross, blackened and scorched, but still exuding a faint aura of sanctity. The Hallowed paused as they reached a clearing. Elias raised the hammer high. The pulse intensified, and the ground began to writhe. Soil split and reformed. Stones cracked and melted into rivulets of metallic substance. From the earth, new figures emerged, part child, part machine, part soil, grafted from the essence of those who had been taken. They were raw, unformed, yet obedient, joining the ranks of the Hallowed without hesitation. Maris whispered a prayer, but the words felt hollow. The sanctity of her voice did not penetrate the ritual unfolding before her. The relic she held pulsed faintly, as if acknowledging the machine god's presence, yet powerless to resist. The Hallowed began to march. Their footsteps were synchronized with the hammer's pulse, a rhythm that echoed through the forest like a mechanical heartbeat. Maris and the others realized with dawning horror that this was no mere movement. It was a ritual, a procession designed to extend the machine god's influence outward, to reshape reality itself. One of the men, a former blacksmith, tried to intervene. He hurled a makeshift spear toward Elias, aiming for the hammer. Time seemed to slow. The spear froze mid-air, suspended by the pulse of the hammer. Elias did not flinch. The Hallowed around him remained unmoving. The spear bent unnaturally, twisting into a loop, and fell to the ground with a metallic clang. Useless. The survivors understood then that the hammer was more than an artifact. It was a conduit, a node connecting the machine god's will to the physical world. Through it, Elias commanded the Hallowed, reshaping matter, controlling flesh, and bending the environment to his will. Maris urged the others to flee. They moved quietly, avoiding the Hallowed's direct gaze, but the forest seemed to betray them. Trees shifted, roots reached for their legs, branches clawed at their faces. Every step forward became a battle not only against the physical obstacles, but against the compulsion exerted by the hammer's pulse. From the air above, faint mechanical sounds could be heard. Servitor-like constructs, small and grotesque, descended from the fog. They moved with purpose, scanning for any survivors, their eyes glowing faintly red. The survivors ducked behind trees, holding their breath, but the presence was inevitable. The machine god's domain extended above as well as below. As they pressed deeper into the forest, the pulse of the hammer intensified. Maris could feel it in her bones, a vibration that sought to reshape her very essence. She collapsed to her knees, clutching the relic, willing it to shield her. The other survivors gathered around her, forming a circle, their faces pale, eyes wide with fear and awe. Elias raised the hammer again. The Hallowed formed concentric circles. Around him, their bodies aligned with the pulse of the artifact. The ground beneath them shifted violently, forming a complex geometric pattern etched in soil, metal, and bone. Maris recognized the shapes from the priest's broken rosary. They were runes of binding, but twisted beyond comprehension, interlaced with mechanical glyphs that seemed alive. The pulse of the hammer reached its crescendo. Maris and the others could no longer distinguish time, space, or even the sound of their own voices. The world bent around them. Trees elongated, the sky darkened unnaturally, and the earth itself seemed to rise in response. Then, the impossible occurred. The hallowed began to march outward, leaving the clearing, spreading like a dark tide into the surrounding lands. Elias stayed behind, hammer in hand, commanding those who would merge with the machine god's will. Each step of the procession reshaped the forest, turning wood into metal, soil into flesh, air into resonance. Maris and her companions ran. They followed a narrow path leading away from the clearing, but each step carried the tension of compulsion. Their minds resisted, yet they could feel the machine god's will tugging at them, whispering promises of power, of unity, of eternal life within the ritual. One by one, the survivors faltered. One man collapsed, clutching his head, screaming as mechanical tendrils burst from his skin. Another disappeared into the fog, drawn irresistibly toward the sound of the hammer's pulse. Maris pressed forward, tears streaking her face, the relic warm in her hand, vibrating faintly with a power she did not understand, but trusted instinctively. From the clearing, a faint echo of the lullaby returned, distorted, layered with the grinding of gears and the hum of machinery. It was no longer a song. It was a call to unity, to transformation. The machine god's dominion extended beyond the hill, beyond the town, beyond the forest. Its reach was infinite, yet precise, bending the will of those who remained outside its immediate grasp. Maris stumbled onto a ridge overlooking the town's ruins. She saw the procession winding through the forest like a river of shadows and iron, the hill at the center, the hammer glowing faintly. Elias stood sentinel, a figure of unholy perfection, commanding the hallowed, orchestrating the world to his and the machine god's design. And in that moment, she understood the scope of the horror. This was no isolated event. The machine god eternal had begun its expansion, a process of assimilation and transformation, and the Wither's children, fused with Elias and the hallowed, were its heralds. Maris realized the impossible. The world beyond the town was next. Nothing could withstand the pulse of the hammer, the command of Elias, or the will of the machine god. Resistance was futile. Obedience, or transformation, was inevitable. As the lullaby intensified, she pressed the relic to her chest, whispering a final prayer. The echoes of the hammer's pulse vibrated through her body, through her mind, through her very soul. The forest trembled beneath the weight of the procession, and the hallowed spread outward like a tide of iron, flesh, and inevitability. Maris closed her eyes. The next step was inevitable. The machine god eternal had begun its dominion, and the world would never be the same. The pulse of the hammer had become omnipresent. Maris, still clutching the relic, moved through a forest twisted beyond recognition. Trees no longer bore leaves, but metallic bristles that scratched and hissed against her clothing. Roots had grown into wire-like tendrils, reaching for her legs with every step. The hallowed moved through this landscape like a tide, a congregation of the machine god's will, their forms both grotesque and precise. Elias led them, hammer raised, eyes glowing red like distant suns. Every movement of his body propagated through the hallowed, bending flesh and metal, commanding obedience. Their march was a liturgy, a ritual of expansion, and Maris felt the inevitability of it pressing against her mind, threatening to unravel her very perception. The relic in her hand pulsed faintly, as if resisting the machine god's dominion. Yet Maris could feel it weakening with each step closer to the hammer. She stumbled over the distorted terrain, stones reshaping beneath her feet, soil bubbling like molten metal, and air thickening, suffocating, carrying whispers in languages she could almost comprehend. From the distance, faint lights glimmered, the remnants of the hollowed's influence spreading into surrounding valleys. Small towns, far beyond the Wither's sight, had begun reporting anomalies, livestock grafted with metal, machinery moving of its own accord, whispers of children singing in the dead of night. The process was no longer localized. It had begun to metastasize. Maris saw one of the hollowed paws, bending down toward the soil. Its skeletal fingers traced patterns in the earth, and from the grooves, new forms began to emerge. Partially formed figures, pale and malleable, awaiting the machine god's guidance. The process was deliberate, ritualistic, precise. She understood then that this was not merely destruction, it was creation, though of a nature that violated all laws of life and machine. The lullaby returned, layered over the grinding of gears and faint clinking of metallic limbs. It was no longer a song of memory, but of indoctrination. Any who heard it felt the compulsion to merge, to serve, to bow before the machine god eternal. Maris pressed her hands to her ears, attempting to block it, yet the pulse penetrated bones, nerves, and sinews. Elias raised the hammer high, and the earth itself responded. Metal rose from the soil, twisting into forms of children and townsfolk, fusing with sinew and wire. Each figure moved with intention, a mirror of those who had already been hollowed, yet incomplete, awaiting final assimilation. Maris recognized the blacksmith among them, his eyes vacant, body stretched unnaturally, wires pulsing like veins. The survivors she had led, those who had managed to keep pace, were faltering. One collapsed, clutching his skull as metallic tendrils erupted from his body, reshaping him against his will. Another began to convulse as gears pushed through skin, small sparks flying. Maris fought to keep her composure, praying, clutching the relic as a tether to humanity, to resistance. They reached the hill. The hammer rested at its apex, pulsating with a rhythm that bent perception itself. Elias stood at the summit, flanked by the skeletal children and hollowed, a congregation of worshippers to the machine god. The hill itself seemed to breathe, rising and falling, metallic and organic, resonating with the pulse. The survivors realized that approaching the hammer was no longer optional. The pulse extended its influence outward, bending the environment, compelling obedience, and distorting perception. To resist was to be consumed. To approach was to risk transformation. Maris stepped forward, feeling the ground shift beneath her. The relic burned faintly in her hands, a reminder of a force opposed to the machine god, though its potency waned with distance. She raised her eyes to Elias, whose form had grown more monstrous with each beat of the hammer. His voice echoed, not in sound, but directly into minds. Bow, bind, merge. The creed is eternal. Resistance is null. The hollowed formed a circle around the hammer, their bodies shifting with impossible precision. Each movement propagated outward, the pulse intensifying. The ground cracked, stones splintered, and the air shimmered with distorted reality. Maris could see fragments of her own thoughts projected into the landscape, memories, fears, desires, all twisted and mirrored in the terrain. She fell to her knees. The relic burned brighter, and for a moment, she felt clarity, a connection to something larger, something beyond the machine god's dominion. It whispered of hope, of resistance, of faith, yet its voice was fragile against the overwhelming pulse of the hammer. Elias struck the hammer into the ground. The shockwave shattered perception itself. Trees bent, shadows elongated, and the hollowed convulsed in synchronized obedience. Maris felt her body pulled toward the hill, toward the hammer, as if invisible hands were reshaping her will. She screamed, voice swallowed by the distortions in air and mind. The hallowed began to move outward again, spreading their influence beyond the hill, through the forest, into valleys, and toward distant settlements. Each step propagated the ritual further, reshaping terrain, merging flesh with iron, bending life to the machine god's creed. Maris rose, clutching the relic, and realized that direct confrontation was impossible. The machine god's power was no longer contained. It had metastasized, touching every living and mechanical form within range. Only resistance in spirit remained, fragile yet unyielding. She whispered a vow, promising to bear witness, to record, to fight where possible, though she knew that survival might mean nothing against the tide. The hammer struck again. Elias's voice, echoing through mind and landscape, declared dominion over all. All shall serve, all shall become. The creed is eternal Maris, and the remaining survivors retreated into the distorted forest. Each step carried the threat of merging, of transformation. The lullaby, now a hymn of indoctrination, echoed in their minds, blending with the grinding pulse of the hammer, a relentless, unceasing rhythm. They paused at a ridge, overlooking the ruins below. The hallowed marched, the hill thrummed, and Elias stood eternal, a sentinel and conductor of the machine god's will. The forest trembled beneath the weight of the procession, and Maris understood the scope of the inevitability. The machine god's dominion had begun its outward expansion, and humanity, as it had existed, was being rewritten in iron and sinew. The relic in her hand pulsed faintly, a flicker of resistance in the tide of inevitability. Maris pressed it to her chest, whispering a final prayer, and made a vow. To survive, to remember, and to bear witness to the horrors she had seen. Above the hill, the pulse of the hammer continued. The lullaby of rust and iron echoed through the land, and the machine god Eternal's creed spread outward, unchallenged, unstoppable, eternal. The procession would continue. Humanity would bend. Reality itself would yield, and the hallowed, led by Elias and the hammer, would not cease. The survivors moved through a forest now alien in every sense. Trees bent unnaturally, their trunks fused with metal, bark interlaced with rusted filigree and pulsating veins. Roots snaked across the ground like sentient tendrils, reaching, probing, searching for anything not yet claimed by the machine god's will. The air was thick with the metallic tang of iron, the pulse of the hammer vibrating faintly, even miles from the hill. Maris led the group, her hands still gripping the relic. Each step carried a weight beyond the physical, an invisible tug at their very consciousness. She felt it in her bones. The machine god's dominion expanding, reshaping thought, perception, and even the laws of the natural world. The survivors moved in silence, fear etched into every movement, hearts beating in rhythm with the distant pulse that had become the heartbeat of reality itself. The terrain around them shifted as if alive. Hills rose and fell unnaturally, forming new ridges and valleys that had not existed moments before. Streams of metallic fluid, half molten and half flesh, twisted across the soil, reshaping it with each pulse. Every step forward carried the tension of anticipation. The hallowed could emerge from any shadow, any distortion in the land, any shimmer in the air. A distant clang echoed through the landscape, and the survivors froze. It was not the hammer striking the earth. This was something different. The sound carried a resonance, a tone that seemed to speak directly to the mind, pressing upon it with authority. Maris recognized it instantly. Another node, another locus of the machine god's expansion, growing independent yet synchronized with Elias and the hill. The forest opened into a clearing, unlike any natural formation. The ground here was blackened, scorched, etched with geometrical patterns impossible for human hands to produce. Metallic spires jutted from the soil, spiraling skyward, each topped with a figure partially formed, suspended between life and machine. Some writhed in agony, others appeared calm, their vacant eyes reflecting the pale light of the pulsing hill miles away. Maris's group approached cautiously, noting the silent observation of these nodes. One survivor, a former soldier named Tyron, knelt to touch a spire. Instantly the pulse reached through him, bending his perception. He saw visions of countless futures, realities consumed by iron and sinew, worlds rewritten in obedience to the machine god, civilizations kneeling before Elias. Tyron screamed, convulsing as small tendrils of metal erupted from his skin, merging with his flesh in a slow, ritualistic transformation. Maris dragged him away, but the process had begun. The relic in her hand pulsed, faintly glowing, resisting, yet unable to halt the inevitable. The hallowed were not limited to the hill. They had become the machine god's emissaries, spreading like seeds, reshaping all life in iron and ritual. From the distance, movement caught her eye. Shadows elongated unnaturally, forming into skeletal figures fused with metal, children now monstrously grown yet still obedient to Elias's will. They approached the clearing, tracing the path of the survivors with mechanical precision, eyes glowing faint red. The lullaby returned, now layered with metallic resonance, vibrating through the very earth, bending perception and will. Maris felt it in her mind, a command, subtle yet insistent, urging her to submit, to kneel, to merge. She resisted, pressing the relic to her chest, whispering prayers that felt insufficient against the overwhelming force. Each pulse of the hammer from the hill propagated through these nodes, coordinating the hallowed in a network of domination and transformation. Tyron screamed again, falling to his knees as wires and sinew forced themselves through his body, reshaping him into a hybrid of flesh and machine. His cries echoed through the clearing, a mixture of agony and distorted reverence. The hallowed approached him, not to harm, but to guide, integrating him into their procession. Maris could only watch, horror tightening her throat. The ground beneath the clearing began to shift. Metallic veins spread outward, rising to form bridges, towers, and conduits connecting the spires. From the sky, fog descended, thick and heavy, carrying whispers in incomprehensible languages. Within the mist, forms moved, both machine and flesh, merging as they approached the nodes. The machine god's dominion was expanding geometrically, every new formation a nexus for further transformation. Maris realized the grim truth. The hammer was only one node. Each node replicated the ritual, extending the reach of the machine god. Elias, now a figure of worship and terror, orchestrated a network of influence spanning miles, each pulse bending reality, reshaping life, converting resistance into obedience. She pressed the relic to her chest, feeling it burn faintly. A whisper reached her, faint but clear. Witness, survive, record. Do not succumb, for knowledge is defiance. It was the last vestige of hope, fragile yet resolute. The hallowed, sensing her awareness, began to move closer. Their footsteps were silent yet resonant, a rhythm that matched the pulse of the nodes and the hill. Maris backed away, dragging the few remaining survivors with her. The metallic forest bent and twisted around them, reshaping paths, attempting to channel them toward the nodes. The machine god's will was relentless, omnipresent, and precise. Suddenly, one of the nodes activated fully. A figure emerged, more complete, more monstrous than any hallowed Maris had seen. It resembled Elias, yet larger, more commanding, with multiple arms of wire and sinew, eyes radiating red light, and a mouth that opened to emit the lullaby as a command. Its presence bent reality, warping the clearing, folding space and time into itself. The survivors froze, paralyzed by the incomprehensible nature of the being. Maris pressed the relic to her chest, feeling it resist, pushing back, providing clarity. She whispered a vow. I will survive. I will bear witness. I will fight. The node pulsed violently. The hollowed and the new figure advanced, the landscape twisting to block retreat. Maris realized that they were now part of a larger ritual, one designed not merely to consume, but to extend the creed of the machine god across every plane of existence accessible to them. And then, above the clearing, a shadow fell. Not from the node, not from the hollowed, but from the sky itself. A rumble, deep and resonant, shook the ground. The fog lifted momentarily, revealing shapes in the clouds, massive constructs of iron, sinew, and warp energy, descending toward the nodes like instruments of judgment. The procession below faltered, sensing a presence that rivaled even Elias in power. Maris's heart pounded. This was no longer a local event. The machine god Eternal's reach had drawn attention beyond the immediate nodes. Forces of unimaginable scale now moved, responding to the ritual, and the hollowed paused, as if recognizing a higher authority. The survivors huddled together, trembling. The relic burned, providing a faint warmth and clarity, yet insufficient to counter the growing horror. Maris knew then that the next phase of the machine god's expansion was inevitable. The hollowed would continue their march, but now the scale of the ritual had shifted. Reality itself was at stake. The lullaby resumed, louder, more insistent, echoing through the clearing, the nodes, and the distant hill. Elias raised the hammer, commanding the hollowed with a precision that transcended mortal comprehension. The new figure from the node advanced, merging the forces below, amplifying the pulse of transformation. Maris pressed the relic to her chest, whispering a final prayer. She would survive. She would bear witness. But the world had already changed. The horizon itself was forged anew in iron and sinew, under the creed of the machine god Eternal, and the hollowed would not cease. The land beyond the nodes was no longer recognizable. Hills, forests, and rivers had been reshaped, melded with iron and sinew, forming a labyrinthine landscape that obeyed the pulse of the hammer. Each step forward carried a weight beyond the physical. Reality itself resisted and reshaped, bending perception and understanding. Maris pressed the relic to her chest, feeling its warmth as a tenuous tether to what remained human. The hollowed moved with terrifying precision, spreading the machine god's influence outward. Their forms were now both ritual and weapon. Skeletal children with mechanical limbs, townsfolk fused with iron, and grotesque hybrids of flesh, wire, and sinew. Each one was a note of obedience, a living extension of Elias's will. From the horizon, a faint metallic glimmer caught Maris's eye. It was the hill, distant, but still radiating the hammer's pulse. Around it, the hollowed had formed a massive concentric array, a ritual pattern etched into the land with bone, metal, and fused earth. The geometry was impossible, bending lines and angles that defied Euclidean understanding. Maris's stomach churned at the sight. This was no longer a town or even a forest. It was a temple of transformation, a nexus of the machine god's dominion. The survivors pressed onward cautiously, moving through terrain that warped beneath their feet. Rivers of molten metal and flesh flowed alongside them, reshaping the ground as they walked. Trees grew and shifted in real time, forming barriers and pathways at the machine god's will. The air hummed with the pulse, vibrating through bones and nerves, echoing the unending lullaby that had become the anthem of obedience. They encountered a hollowed node, partially formed, yet more complete than any they had seen before. It resembled a townsperson, but the body was grafted with mechanical prosthetics, wires entwined with sinew, and eyes that glowed red. It moved with deliberate care, gesturing toward Maris and the others. Instinctively, they recoiled, but the entity's movements were not hostile. It was offering guidance, or perhaps a warning. From the node's mouth came no words, only resonance, vibrating directly into their minds. Images flashed. The hill, the hammer, Elias commanding the hallowed, and countless other nodes spreading across the land. Each pulse was a command, a ritual act, and a law, bending reality, warping life, and reshaping those who dared approach. Maris felt the pulse penetrate deeper than ever. The relic burned faintly, resisting yet insufficient to halt the inevitable. Her mind grasped at fragments of clarity. The machine god's dominion was expanding geometrically, each node creating further nodes, each pulse extending its influence further into the world. Resistance was mathematically insignificant, yet she could not surrender her consciousness entirely. Survival required movement, observation, and cunning. The survivors pressed on, now aware that the landscape itself was the weapon. Paths twisted unpredictably, hills rose and fell impossibly, and shadows moved with independent will. The hallowed appeared and disappeared, always in motion, always observing, always shaping reality. Each encounter left Maris's mind strained, her perception bending, yet the relic's presence offered a fragile shield. Above the transformed land, a shadow fell. From the sky descended massive constructs, partially mechanical, partially organic, each radiating warp energy. The hallowed paused, recognizing a presence beyond Elias's control, and the pulse of the hammer resonated in a different rhythm. The machine god's dominion was no longer singular. It was interacting with an unknown force, something vast, ancient, and indifferent. The relic vibrated violently, pulling Maris's focus inward. She saw visions of the Wither's children, now fully merged with iron and ritual, serving as conduits for Elias's will. Their presence extended the pulse, bending the land, transforming flesh, and enforcing obedience. Yet there were gaps in the ritual, imperfections that suggested the network was not entirely complete. Maris understood that these gaps were opportunities, small fissures in the machine. God's dominion through which resistance, however fragile, might persist. The survivors pressed forward, navigating rivers of molten flesh, bridges of fused bone and metal, and pathways reshaped at will. Each step brought them closer to the hill, closer to Elias, and closer to the ultimate ritual that would extend the machine god's influence globally. They could feel the gravity of inevitability pressing upon them, a constant tug at their minds and bodies. A sudden tremor shook the ground. One of the massive constructs above descended, landing with a force that twisted the earth. The hallowed shuddered, but continued their movements, reorganizing in response. The pulse of the hammer synchronized with this new presence, bending perception, amplifying the ritual, and compelling obedience in a manner previously unseen. Maris and the survivors realized that time itself was being rewritten. Moments stretched and compressed, past and future coexisting. Memories overlapping with visions of inevitability. The machine. God's will was no longer just a force. It was a dimension, an extension of the universe that reshaped reality around its nodes. The hill came into view, closer now, the hammer's pulse more intense, more insistent. Elias stood atop it, a monolith of flesh and iron, commanding the hallowed with precision that transcended mortal comprehension. The hallowed below moved with near-divine synchronicity, forming a living network, an orchestra of obedience and transformation. Maris pressed the relic to her chest, whispering a vow, "I will survive. I will witness. I will resist." The relic pulsed in response, faint yet distinct, a fragile counterpoint to the machine god's overwhelming power. She understood that survival alone was meaningless if the world around her fell entirely under Elias's dominion. Observation, memory, and defiance became her weapons. The lullaby returned, louder, layered with the grinding pulse of the hammer and the resonance of distant nodes. The hallowed advanced, merging with the transformed landscape, spreading the ritual further. The horizon itself was forged anew in iron and sinew, the land reshaped into a nexus of obedience and transformation. Maris understood that the final confrontation was imminent. The hill, the hammer, Elias, the hollowed, and the nodes all converged into a singular point of inevitability. Survival would require cunning, courage, and the willingness to witness the transformation of reality itself. The relic burned faintly in her hands, a final tether to hope, resistance, and humanity. She pressed forward, toward the hill, knowing that what awaited was both the culmination of the machine god's creed and the next test of endurance, perception, and will. Above, the constructs remained, silent, observing, and perhaps waiting. Below, the hollowed and nodes pulsed in unison, a living testament to the machine god's dominion. And the lullaby, the hymn of rust, sinew, and iron, echoed through the reshaped world. Maris's vow echoed in her mind. I will survive. I will witness. I will resist. The nexus awaited. The hill loomed before them, colossal and impossible, a convergence of iron, flesh, and ritual geometry. Maris's legs burned with fatigue, each step a battle against the pulse that had transformed the landscape itself. The hollowed moved like a tide around the hill, reshaping terrain, bending the laws of biology, physics, and reality to the will of the machine god eternal. Elias stood atop the apex, hammer raised, eyes glowing with crimson intensity that seemed to pierce the sky itself. Around him, nodes pulsated, each a miniature replication of the hammer's dominion, expanding the creed of iron and sinew across every inch of the forest, the hills, and far beyond. The lullaby, once a simple melody, had become a hymn of cosmic inevitability, a resonance that vibrated through bones, consciousness, and the very ether. Maris pressed the relic to her chest, feeling its warmth as a fragile tether to humanity. The pulse of the hammer threatened to tear her mind asunder, yet the relic held, faint but persistent. She knew the time for observation was over. Action, however small, was imperative. The machine god's dominion had grown too powerful to simply flee. The hollowed moved toward her group, yet the relic seemed to repel them slightly, a localized field of resistance. Still, each step forward brought the pulse closer, reshaping reality in micro-fractures. Roots twisting into tendrils, air thickening, shadows extending impossibly. The survivors pressed forward, each heartbeat synchronized with the pulse, each breath a battle against compulsion. Elias struck the hammer into the apex of the hill. The shock wave radiated outward, bending perception and reality. Metallic spires shook, fused with sinew, and the ground trembled under the weight of inevitable transformation. From the nodes, the hollowed surged, merging with the landscape in a grotesque choreography of obedience. Maris felt herself pulled toward the apex, the relic vibrating violently, tethering her will to resistance. From the apex, Elias's voice echoed, not through air but through mind. All shall serve. All shall merge. The machine, God eternal, is eternal. Resistance is null. The hollowed formed a living bridge, connecting Maris's position to the hill. Roots, wires, and sinew twisted, forming pathways of flesh and metal. Each step brought the survivors closer to the epicenter of transformation. Maris's chest burned with the relic's pulse. It spoke faintly, urging clarity, focus, defiance. At the base of the hill, a fissure opened. From it emerged figures partially formed, screaming in agony, their bodies fused with iron. These were the latest additions to the machine god's creed, rising to join the hollowed in the ritual of expansion. Maris felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon her. Every life consumed, every mind bent, every law of reality rewritten in service of Elias and the machine god. She pressed forward. The hollowed parted, forming a corridor of obedience through which she could approach the apex. Each step was a negotiation with reality itself. The terrain twisted beneath her feet, the air thickened, and shadows reached for her. The relic burned faintly, guiding her, offering a faint resistance against the overwhelming pulse. Elias's eyes met hers. The hammer pulsed violently, sending vibrations through the forest, the nodes, and the hollowed. Time fractured. Moments stretched and compressed. Past, present, and potential futures converged at the apex of the hill. Maris understood then that she faced not merely a man, but a conduit of cosmic dominion. Elias was both orchestrator and instrument of the machine god eternal. The hollowed began to merge into a single wave, a living river of sinew and metal flowing upward, reshaping the hill as it moved. Maris pressed forward, the relic pulsing in opposition to the hammer's rhythm. She reached the edge of the apex. The wind carried the metallic tang of iron and sinew, the vibrations so intense they pressed against her skull. The hill itself seemed alive now, breathing, expanding, reshaping. The nodes pulsed in unison, a network of power connecting Elias, the hollowed, and the machine god's will. Maris felt the weight of inevitability. Reality itself was being rewritten. Her mind flashed with visions of countless worlds, all reshaped in obedience to iron and ritual, all consumed by the creed of the machine god eternal. She raised the relic, feeling it respond to her will, faintly glowing with the last vestiges of resistance. The lullaby, once melodic, now screamed through the air, bone and consciousness. Maris pressed forward, stepping onto the living pathway formed of hollowed flesh and wire. Each step felt like eternity, each heartbeat resonating with the pulse, each breath a battle against the compulsion to merge. At the apex, Elias awaited. The hammer radiated pulses of inevitability, bending reality and thought. The hollowed formed a circle around him, bodies fused into a network of obedience. Maris approached, relic raised, whispering a vow. I will survive. I will witness. I will resist. The hammer struck the apex again. Time fractured. Shadows lengthened, twisted, merged. Reality bent around the epicenter of ritual. Elias advanced, hammer raised, and the hollowed surged, attempting to assimilate, to merge, to enforce the creed. Maris pressed the relic to the ground, sending a pulse of resistance. The nodes faltered slightly, the hollowed convulsed, the landscape shuddered. For a brief moment, the machine god's dominion wavered. The lullaby fractured, the pulse stuttered. Yet Elias advanced, unrelenting. The hammer pulsed violently, bending the world around him, and the hollowed surged forward, waves of sinew and wire attempting to engulf Maris and the survivors. The relic burned, pushing back, but the tide of inevitability was near absolute. Maris realized the truth. The ritual could not be stopped. The machine god eternal's expansion was unstoppable, inevitable. Her role was not to prevent, but to survive, to bear witness, to record the transformation of reality itself. She pressed the relic to her chest, whispering her vow, feeling the pulse of resistance within her, faint yet undeniable. The hollowed surged, merging with the hill, the apex, the nodes. Elias raised the hammer high, striking a final time. The landscape bent, twisted, reshaped. The survivors were consumed by the edge of inevitability, yet Maris pressed onward, holding the relic, tethered to resistance. The lullaby faded, replaced by a deep, resonant hum of iron, sinew, and reality. Bending, Maris felt herself drawn upward, yet apart, a witness to the final phase of transformation. The hill, the nodes, the hollowed, and Elias had become a single entity, a nexus of the machine god's dominion, eternal, unstoppable. She pressed the relic to her chest, whispering one final prayer. The landscape stretched into eternity, reshaped, reforged, and the machine god eternal's creed had consumed all. And yet, as the pulse of inevitability spread outward, Maris understood the final truth. She survived. She was a witness. She carried the knowledge, the memory, the horror, humanity, the world. Reality itself had been altered. Obedience, transformation, and ritual had triumphed. The hammer rested. The hollowed were silent. The nodes pulsed faintly, a network of eternal expansion. Elias stood, an immortal sentinel of iron and flesh, the machine god Eternal's will made manifest. Maris breathed, clutching the relic, knowing that the world beyond would never be the same. The creed had been enforced, the ritual completed, and the horizon forged in sinew and metal. The lullaby returned, faint, distant, yet omnipresent, echoing through the reshaped world. The machine god Eternal had begun its eternal forge. Maris whispered her vow one last time. I will survive. I will witness. I will resist. And in the reshaped horizon, the echoes of humanity, iron and ritual would endure.